Officer Derek Collins had spent 15 years believing one simple thing, that the badge pinned to his chest made him untouchable. He had built his entire identity on that belief, wearing it the way other men wore confidence, like something earned rather than something merely borrowed from a uniform. Colleagues described him as steady under pressure, reliable on paper, the kind of officer who never seemed to second-guess himself even when perhaps he should have. So when he humiliated a black woman during what should have been a routine traffic stop on an ordinary evening, he never once considered that there might be consequences waiting for him on the other side of that decision. After all, people usually stayed silent when men like him raised their voice in that particular tone. They apologized for things they never did. They lowered their eyes, swallowed their pride, and walked away, grateful simply to be allowed to leave without further incident. But this woman did not walk away. She stood there in the glow of his patrol lights, calm and composed, and quietly began collecting every receipt, every witness, every camera angle, and every lie that came out of his mouth that night. Weeks later, Derek walked into a courtroom, expecting another easy victory, the kind he had grown accustomed to winning without ever truly trying. Instead, he found himself staring across the aisle at the one woman in the entire city he should never have underestimated. And by the end of that hearing, his career, his reputation, and everything he believed about his own power would be gone for good. Long before that night, Angela Brooks had already earned a quiet reputation as someone who never backed down from a fight she believed was worth having, even when the odds seemed stacked entirely against her. She had grown up in that same city, watching her own mother navigate a world that rarely extended patience or fairness to women who looked like them, and she had carried that memory into every courtroom she ever entered. Friends often said that Angela had a way of making people feel safe enough to tell the truth, even when the truth felt dangerous to say out loud. That gift had served her well over 2 decades of practicing law, building a career defined less by dramatic wins and more by the steady accumulation of people who finally felt heard. Angela Brooks was 48 years old, a civil rights attorney known throughout her small southern city for her composure, long before she was known for her courtroom victories. She never raised her voice to prove a point and never wore her achievements like armor, yet everyone who met her seemed to walk away with a quiet sense that they had just spoken with someone who understood the world more clearly than most. She had built her reputation not through spectacle, but through patience, the kind of patience that came from years of watching systems fail people who looked like her and deciding again and again to do something meaningful about it. Clients trusted her because she listened first and spoke second, because she never promised an easy outcome, only an honest fight. On the evening this story begins, Angela had just returned from a legal conference 2 towns over, her mind still half occupied with notes on civil procedure and half occupied with the simple pleasure of a quiet drive home through familiar streets. The conference had reminded her, as these gatherings often did, of how slowly justice could move and how much patience the work truly required. The roads were empty, the streetlights soft against the early darkness, and there was nothing about the night that suggested anything unusual was about to happen. She had the radio on low, humming along absently, completely unaware that her evening was about to take a turn that would alter the course of her year. Across town, Officer Derek Collins was 42 years old and had worn his badge for nearly 2 decades, long enough to stop questioning the quiet privileges that came with it. He was known among certain residents, though rarely among his fellow officers, for a pattern of behavior that bordered on harassment, a habit of stopping people for reasons that never quite held up to scrutiny, once anyone bothered to ask. He believed, with the kind of certainty that only comes from never being meaningfully challenged, that no one in this city would ever dare stand against him in any real way. His shift that night had been slow, almost uneventful, and there was a restlessness in him that sometimes pushed him toward stops he might otherwise have skipped entirely. That night, as Angela's car passed beneath a flickering street lamp on her way home, Derek's patrol lights suddenly flared to life behind her, and the entire evening shifted into something else entirely. Something neither of them could have predicted from where they sat in that quiet moment. Derek had not always been the man he became. Younger officers who joined the department after him sometimes heard stories about how promising he had once seemed, how his early years on the force had been marked by genuine dedication rather than the careless arrogance that later defined him. Something had hardened in him over time, a slow erosion that came from years of being told, in ways both subtle and direct, that his judgment would rarely be questioned. He had stopped noticing the moment respect for the badge curdled into entitlement, the way a person rarely notices the exact instant a habit becomes a character flaw. By the time he pulled up behind Angela's car that evening, he had long since stopped wondering whether his instincts were fair, only whether they were convenient. The reason he gave for the stop was vague, at best. Something about her vehicle looking suspicious, in a way he could not quite articulate when she asked him directly. Angela pulled over without hesitation, her hands resting calmly on the wheel, as he approached her window with the unhurried swagger of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. She asked him politely what law she had broken, her voice steady and measured, the voice of someone who had spent years asking exactly the right questions, in exactly the right tone in rooms, far more hostile than this one. Derek's expression shifted almost immediately, a flicker of irritation crossing his face as though her composure itself was some kind of provocation aimed directly at him. He had expected nervousness, perhaps fear, certainly not the calm, unblinking patience she offered instead. Anyone watching from a distance might have sensed it then. The quiet beginning of something deeply unfair, a confrontation forming not because of anything she had actually done, but because of who she was and who he believed himself to be in that moment. What started as a routine stop quickly began to spiral into something far more humiliating than Angela could have anticipated when she first pulled to the side of the road. Derek ordered her out of the vehicle, then demanded she open her trunk, and finally insisted on searching through her personal bag without offering any real justification whatsoever. Angela, who understood the law as well as anyone practicing in that city, asked him calmly whether he had a warrant authorizing any of this, or even a reasonable basis to suspect wrongdoing. The question landed like a spark on dry grass. Derek's voice rose, sharp and accusatory, as though her simple awareness of her own rights was somehow an act of open defiance against him personally and professionally. He began speaking louder, leaning closer, letting his frustration spill into open intimidation, in a way that drew the attention of a few residents passing by on the nearby sidewalk, their footsteps slowing as they realized something was wrong. The street lamp above them buzzed faintly, casting an uneven light across the pavement, as Derek's flashlight swept over the contents of her bag with theatrical scrutiny, lingering far longer than any legitimate inspection would require. A neighbor walking her dog paused at the corner, phone half raised before thinking better of it, unsure whether recording would help or simply escalate things further. Angela noticed the hesitation in the woman's posture and offered the smallest shake of her head, a silent signal that she did not need rescuing, only witnessing. That single gesture, small as it was, would later become one of the most important details in the entire case, because the neighbor remembered it vividly enough to describe it in precise detail months later under oath. Angela did not raise her voice in return, even as the pressure of the moment pressed down on her from every direction. She stood there, steady and unshaken, even as Derek's tone grew increasingly aggressive, and his words grew increasingly careless with every passing minute. In his mind, she was nothing more than another woman who would eventually break, apologize, and disappear into the long list of people he had intimidated before, without consequence or scrutiny. He thought of her in that ugly, unspoken way some men in power think of those they look down on, as simply another faceless inconvenience standing between him and the quiet end of his shift. Those few residents who had paused to watch felt something shift in the air around them, a quiet recognition that they were witnessing an injustice unfolding in real time, and somewhere beneath their discomfort, a growing dislike for the man standing behind that badge. Rather than de-escalating the situation, Derek made the decision to escalate it further, choosing the one path that would ultimately destroy everything he had spent 15 years building. In his official report, filed later that same night, he claimed that Angela had been combative, that she had refused to cooperate, and that her behavior throughout the encounter had been suspicious enough to warrant her temporary detention at the station. None of it was true, but in that moment, his word was the only one that seemed to matter to anyone reviewing the paperwork. Angela was taken to the station and held for several long hours, questioned repeatedly, without ever being formally charged with anything resembling a real offense. Eventually, with no case to hold her on and no evidence to justify the detention, they released her into the cool night air, her composure still fully intact despite everything she had just endured that evening. During those hours inside the station, Angela said little beyond what was necessary, choosing instead to observe everything around her with the same careful attention she brought to every case she had ever handled. She noted the names on the desk plates, the time displayed on the wall clock when she arrived, and when she was finally released, the casual way other officers glanced at her, without ever asking why she had been brought in. None of them seemed curious enough to question the situation, which told her almost as much about the department as anything Derek himself had said or done that night. By the time she walked out into the parking lot, she had already begun building the case in her mind, long before she ever opened her laptop to make it official. As she walked toward her car, Derek called out behind her with a smirk stretched across his face, telling her that if she wanted to sue him, she was more than welcome to try her luck. It was meant as a final humiliation, a closing insult delivered with the confidence of a man who had said similar things to dozens of people before her and watched every single one of them quietly back down. He had no idea, standing there in that empty parking lot congratulating himself, that this single careless sentence would become the first domino in the complete collapse of his entire career. Angela said nothing in response, choosing instead to let her silence carry its own quiet weight. She simply got into her car, drove home through the dark streets, and sat down at her kitchen table, with her laptop glowing softly in the late evening light. She opened a new folder on her desktop and typed in a name that would soon mean far more than either of them could imagine that night, a folder she simply labeled The Collins Investigation, and then she began to write down everything she remembered while it was still fresh. Angela did not allow anger to guide her next steps, because she understood something that Derek never did, that rage burns quickly, while patience builds something permanent and far harder to dismantle. Instead of lashing out, she chose to do something far more dangerous to a man like him. She chose to investigate quietly and thoroughly, gathering every piece of evidence she could find, before anyone even knew she was looking into it. Over the following days, she requested footage from nearby storefronts that had cameras facing the street, pulled traffic camera recordings from the city archive through a formal request, and reached out to the handful of residents who had witnessed the stop from the sidewalk that night. She also obtained, through entirely legal channels available to any attorney, the dispatch recordings from the police radio, the kind of raw, unfiltered audio that rarely lined up neatly with an officer's polished written report once both were compared side by side. What she found in those early days was more troubling than she had expected, even with all her years of experience handling difficult cases. Several details in Derek's official report simply did not match the timeline preserved on camera. Small inconsistencies that, taken individually, might have meant nothing, but together began forming a clear and damning pattern of deception. The footage showed no resistance whatsoever, no aggressive behavior of any kind, nothing that remotely resembled the combative woman described in his paperwork that night. Angela began to realize, with a growing sense of unease settling in her chest, that this likely was not the first time Derek Collins had written a report that bent the truth in order to protect himself from scrutiny. If it had happened to her, a trained attorney who knew exactly how to document every single detail, it had almost certainly happened before to others who never had the tools or the confidence to fight back against it. She spent long evenings at her kitchen table cross-referencing timestamps, lining up the traffic camera footage against the dispatch audio minute by minute until the gaps in Derek's story became impossible to ignore. There were moments in the recording where his voice carried a casualness that did not match the urgency described in his written account, small slips that revealed a man more concerned with covering himself than describing what had actually happened. She printed everything, organized it into labeled folders, and built a timeline on a corkboard she kept in a spare room. The kind of methodical work that rarely made for exciting conversation, but almost always made for an unshakable case. Friends who visited during those weeks sometimes asked if she ever doubted herself, and she always answered the same way, explaining that doubt was useful only until the evidence settled the question for good. That realization changed the shape of everything that followed, because Angela understood that this could no longer simply be about clearing her own name from a false report. She began quietly reaching out to people in the community, asking gentle, careful questions about their own encounters with the same officer over the years, questions phrased in a way that made it safe for them to finally say what they had been carrying in silence for far too long. The stories that came back to her were strikingly similar in tone, even when the specific details differed from one account to the next. People spoke of being threatened during stops that had no clear justification behind them, of being pulled over for reasons that evaporated the moment they dared to ask a simple question, of being treated with a hostility that seemed to have little to do with anything they had actually done wrong. Most of these residents, however, were too afraid to put their names behind their stories, having watched what happened to anyone who tried to challenge a police officer in their city before this. Angela understood that fear intimately, because she had spent her entire career standing beside people who carried exactly that kind of fear into her small office. She did not pressure any of them, but she patiently explained how documentation worked, how evidence could protect them rather than expose them further, and how silence had only ever protected the people doing the harming in the first place. Slowly, one by one, over the course of several careful weeks, a small number of them agreed to speak on the record, their voices joining hers in a case that was growing far larger than a single traffic stop on a quiet street. Among those who finally agreed to speak was a young schoolteacher named Marcus Webb, who described an encounter from nearly 2 years earlier that he had never reported because he assumed no one would believe him over a police officer. He recalled being pulled over on his way home from a late evening shift, accused of matching the description of someone involved in a minor disturbance several streets away, an explanation that fell apart the moment he asked a single, clarifying question. He remembered the way Derek's voice had shifted from routine to hostile in a matter of seconds, the same shift Angela herself had experienced firsthand. Hearing his account, Angela realized that the pattern stretched back further than she had originally estimated, and that the silence surrounding Derek Collins had been protecting him for years longer than anyone outside the department had ever suspected. The breakthrough that shifted the entire investigation came when a former employee of the police department, someone who had left the force quietly years earlier, under circumstances no one fully understood at the time, agreed to speak with Angela in strict confidence. This person revealed something that confirmed her worst suspicions, explaining that Derek Collins had been the subject of internal complaints multiple times throughout his long career, each one quietly buried before it could ever reach a formal disciplinary hearing. There had been warnings issued informally behind closed doors, quiet conversations meant to correct his behavior without ever creating a paper trail that could follow him into the future. It became clear, listening to this account unfold, that an entire system had been protecting him for years, shielding him from consequences in exchange for the simple convenience of looking the other way. For the first time, the people listening to Angela's growing case could see not just one bad officer acting alone, but a structure that had allowed him to remain that way for far too long without correction. The former employee described a particular meeting from several years earlier, one where a supervisor had quietly suggested that Derek take some time off rather than face a formal review following a complaint that had been especially difficult to dismiss outright. Instead of treating that suggestion as a warning, Derek had returned from his brief leave more confident than before, having learned only that consequences could be negotiated away if he simply waited long enough. That pattern, repeated quietly over the years, had taught him exactly the wrong lesson, reinforcing the very behavior that should have ended his career far earlier than it eventually did. Angela carefully documented every detail of this account, understanding that it would later become one of the clearest illustrations of institutional failure the jury would ever see presented to them. Armed with a mounting body of evidence carefully organized and cross-referenced, Angela formally filed her lawsuit, and within days, the news had spread far beyond anything she could have controlled or contained on her own. The story moved through the city like a current, passing from neighbor to neighbor, business to business, until it seemed as though everyone had an opinion about what had happened on that quiet street weeks earlier. Reporters began calling for statements outside her office. Community groups organized meetings to discuss what they had heard, and the police department found itself facing a level of public attention it had clearly never anticipated having to manage. Derek, however, remained remarkably unbothered by all of it, still convinced that the systems built to protect him would continue functioning exactly as they always had in the past. He believed, with the same unshaken confidence that had carried him through 15 years of unchecked behavior, that the police union would step in to shield him from any real consequences, and that the city would eventually offer a quiet settlement just to make the story disappear from the headlines. In private conversations with colleagues at the station, he reportedly mocked the lawsuit altogether, joking about Angela's case as though it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience destined to fade away within a few news cycles at most. He spoke about her with a dismissiveness that revealed exactly how little he understood the woman he was dealing with, treating her careful, methodical approach as weakness rather than recognizing it for the quiet, patient danger that it actually was beneath the surface. His union representative, a man who had successfully smoothed over several of Derek's earlier complaints, assured him in a brief meeting that the city had little appetite for a prolonged public fight and would likely move to settle before the case ever reached a jury. Derek took comfort in that assurance, repeating it to himself whenever doubt threatened to creep in during quiet moments alone. What he failed to account for was Angela's refusal to accept any settlement that did not include real accountability, a condition that made the kind of quiet resolution he expected impossible from the very beginning. She had explained to her own legal team early on that money alone would never satisfy what this case was actually about, and that a settlement without consequence would simply teach Derek that his behavior carried no real cost at all. The turning point arrived when the presiding judge granted a motion allowing Angela's legal team to expand the scope of their investigation into Derek's prior conduct over the years. This single ruling cracked open a door that had been sealed for a long time, granting access to old internal files, prior complaints, and records that the department had clearly hoped would remain buried indefinitely from public view. Old case files that had been quietly closed without proper resolution were suddenly being reopened and examined under a far harsher light than they had ever faced before in their existence. For the very first time since this entire situation began, Derek felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest, a thin thread of genuine worry that things might not unfold exactly the way he had always assumed they would for him. As the expanded investigation moved forward, Derek's defense team began encountering one obstacle after another, each new piece of evidence chipping away at the story they had been carefully preparing to tell the jury. Additional video footage surfaced from sources no one had anticipated finding, recordings that placed his actions in a far less favorable light than his original report had ever described to anyone. More witnesses, encouraged by the growing public attention surrounding the case, came forward with their own accounts of past encounters, adding considerable weight and credibility to a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as simple coincidence. Within the department itself, some of his former colleagues began quietly distancing themselves from him, declining to comment when reporters asked direct questions and avoiding conversations that might tie their names too closely to his rapidly unraveling situation. The pressure surrounding the case intensified with every passing week, fueled by relentless media coverage that refused to let the story fade quietly into the background of public attention. Local news outlets ran segment after segment, each one adding new details that kept the public's focus firmly fixed on the unfolding scandal at the center of the city. Community organizations held public meetings demanding transparency from the department, insisting that this particular case finally be the one where accountability followed misconduct rather than quietly disappearing the way so many others had before. Derek began to understand, perhaps for the first time in his entire career, that the situation had grown far beyond anything he could control through intimidation or quiet influence behind the scenes. The comfortable confidence that had carried him for 15 years was beginning to erode steadily, replaced slowly by a creeping unease that followed him into every single shift he worked. At home, those closest to him began noticing the change as well, watching him grow quieter at dinner and shorter-tempered over small things that never used to bother him. He stopped mentioning the case entirely, deflecting questions with a tight smile that fooled no one who knew him well. Word eventually reached him that several officers he had once considered close friends had quietly agreed to cooperate with Angela's legal team rather than risk their own credibility by defending him publicly. That betrayal, as he privately called it, stung more than any single piece of evidence presented against him, because it confirmed something he had spent his entire career refusing to believe, that the loyalty he assumed surrounded him had never been as solid as he imagined. Then came the discovery that would ultimately seal his fate completely, a piece of camera footage that had somehow gone unnoticed during the earlier stages of the entire investigation. It had been captured from an angle no one initially considered relevant, a private security camera belonging to a nearby business that happened to face the exact stretch of road where the encounter had taken place that night. When Angela's team obtained and carefully reviewed the footage, they immediately understood its significance, recognizing it as the kind of evidence capable of dismantling an entire defense in a matter of seconds once presented properly. It was the piece that would finally bring everything into devastating clarity, the moment that would end whatever remained of Derek Collins's career as a sworn police officer in that city. The day of the trial arrived with an atmosphere thick enough to feel heavy in the air, long before anyone even stepped through the courthouse doors that morning. The courtroom filled quickly, packed with residents, reporters, and community members who had followed every twist of the case, since it first made headlines weeks earlier in the local press. Derek walked in with the same confident posture he had carried throughout his entire career, still clinging to the belief that somehow, in some way, things would tilt back in his favor before the day finally ended. Angela arrived shortly after him, composed and steady, carrying herself with the same quiet authority that had defined her from the very beginning of this entire ordeal, her presence alone seeming to shift the energy of the room. Her legal team began methodically presenting their case, building it piece by careful piece in front of a courtroom that seemed to lean forward collectively with every new exhibit introduced into evidence. They played the original traffic stop footage first, allowing the jury to watch in real time as the gap between Derek's written report and the actual events on screen grew impossible to ignore or explain away. They walked the room through a precise timeline, cross-referencing dispatch audio, with security footage in a way that left no room for ambiguity or any convenient excuse to hide behind. Witness after witness took the stand over the course of that long afternoon, each account reinforcing the pattern that had been quietly forming for years beneath the surface of this small, close-knit city. With every new piece of testimony presented to the jury, the internal department records that had once been buried were brought fully into the light, exposing years of complaints that had been dismissed without proper investigation or follow-up. Each lie embedded carefully in Derek's original report was systematically dismantled in front of the very jury whose judgment would ultimately decide his future and his freedom. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the proceedings continued hour after hour, his composed exterior beginning to crack under the relentless weight of evidence stacking steadily against him. For the crowd gathered in that courtroom, there was a quiet, almost electric satisfaction in watching a man who had spent years believing himself completely untouchable finally face the truth he could no longer outrun or explain away. During cross-examination, Derek's own attorney struggled to maintain a coherent narrative, repeatedly asking him to clarify statements that contradicted the timeline established by the footage already shown to the jury. Derek's answers grew shorter and more defensive, with each passing question, his earlier confidence replaced by a visible tension that even the jurors seated farthest from him could not help but notice. Marcus Webb's testimony, delivered calmly, despite the nervousness he admitted to feeling beforehand, added another layer of credibility to the broader pattern Angela's team had spent months assembling. The former department employee who had agreed to testify confirmed under oath that complaints against Derek had indeed been filed and quietly set aside long before this case ever reached a courtroom, a statement that visibly unsettled several officials seated near the back of the room. The emotional peak of the trial arrived when Angela's team finally played the newly discovered security footage for the entire courtroom to witness together. The video left no room for interpretation whatsoever, showing with painful clarity that there had been no resistance, no suspicious behavior, and absolutely no legal justification for either the search or the lengthy detention that followed it. It confirmed, beyond any reasonable doubt remaining in the room, that Derek had knowingly fabricated the account contained in his official written report. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom as the footage played out in full from beginning to end, broken only by the soft, almost involuntary gasps of those seeing the unfiltered truth laid bare for the very first time that day. In that singular moment, something in the room shifted permanently and irreversibly, the balance of power tilting entirely away from the man who had once believed his badge made him untouchable in every meaningful sense. The presiding judge addressed the courtroom directly afterward, delivering a pointed and unflinching rebuke of the clear abuse of authority that had just been exposed for everyone present to witness. Derek sat motionless. As the words landed one after another, the realization finally settling fully into him that there was no version of this outcome where he walked away unscathed from what had happened. There was no clever argument left for his attorneys to offer, no excuse sturdy enough to hold against everything the evidence had already proven beyond any reasonable dispute. His career, the very identity he had built his entire adult life around, was crumbling in real time, in front of the same community he had once intimidated into uneasy silence for so long. When the jury finally returned with its decision after several hours of deliberation, the courtroom fell into a hush so complete that the sound of the foreman clearing his throat seemed to echo against the walls. Angela sat perfectly still as the verdict was read aloud, her expression unreadable to anyone watching, though those who knew her well could see the faintest release of tension in her shoulders. Derek, by contrast, stared straight ahead at nothing in particular, his jaw tight, his hands pressed flat against the table in front of him, as though bracing for impact. Outside the courthouse afterward, the crowd that had gathered on the steps erupted into a quiet, almost reverent murmur rather than celebration, the kind of reaction that comes from people who understand they have just witnessed something rare rather than something merely satisfying. In the weeks that followed the verdict, the consequences for Derek Collins arrived swiftly, and without the protection he had always assumed would continue shielding him from harm. He was formally terminated from the police department, stripped of the badge he had once believed made him untouchable in every meaningful sense of that word. An internal investigation was opened into his broader conduct as an officer, examining years of complaints that had previously been dismissed without any real scrutiny applied to them. Beyond the simple loss of his career, he was also held civilly liable for the harm he had caused over the years, a financial and legal burden that would follow him long after the headlines eventually faded from public memory. The ripple effects of the case extended far beyond Derek himself, reaching deep into the very structure of the department that had quietly protected him for so long without question. Facing intense and sustained public pressure, the police department announced a series of meaningful reforms intended to prevent similar abuses from happening again to anyone else in the community. New oversight procedures were introduced, designed specifically to ensure that complaints against officers could no longer be quietly buried the way they had been for years before this case. Additional training programs were mandated department-wide, focusing specifically on accountability, de-escalation, and the basic rights of citizens during routine encounters with law enforcement officers. A newly created civilian review board was established within months, made up of residents from across the city who were given real authority to examine complaints that previously would have disappeared into a drawer somewhere inside the department. Several officers, emboldened by the outcome of the trial, came forward on their own to report concerns they had carried silently for years, concerns about colleagues whose conduct had never matched the standard the badge was supposed to represent. The police chief, addressing the public directly for the first time since the scandal broke, acknowledged that the department had failed not only Angela, but every resident who had ever been afraid to speak up before her. It was an admission that would have been unthinkable months earlier, and for many in the community, it represented the first real sign that something fundamental had actually shifted rather than simply been managed for the sake of appearances. In the aftermath of everything she had endured and ultimately exposed to the public, a journalist approached Angela outside the courthouse and asked her a simple but pointed question, wondering aloud what had kept her from giving up at any point along the long road behind her. Angela paused for only a moment, before answering with the same quiet steadiness that had carried her through every single stage of the difficult case. She told the reporter that she had never been fighting only for herself, explaining that her real motivation had always been the people who had been forced into silence long before she ever became personally involved in any of it. Her words carried the full weight of everyone whose stories had quietly joined hers throughout the long investigation, the people who finally felt seen because she had simply refused to look away from what was happening. As Angela walked down the courthouse steps that afternoon, the late sunlight spilled across the worn stone in a way that felt almost deliberate, warm, and steady against the cool autumn air settling over the city. Behind her stood dozens of residents who had gathered quietly to witness the outcome. Many of them people who had once felt powerless against a system that seemed built entirely to protect anyone wearing a badge. Something had shifted in them as well, over the course of those long weeks, a quiet recognition that silence was not the only option available when faced with injustice, that documentation and patience could accomplish what fear had always told them was impossible to achieve. They watched her walk away from that courthouse, not as a celebrity seeking attention, but as living proof that the truth, given enough time and enough courage, eventually finds its own way into the light. What happened in that small southern city became, in time, a quiet reminder carried far beyond its own borders, a lesson repeated wherever people gathered to discuss power and its proper limits. Authority, no matter how confidently it is worn by the person holding it, was never meant to stand above the very law it claims to enforce on others. And the most dangerous thing a man who abuses that power will ever encounter is not anger, not retaliation, and not even public outrage directed at him, but a person who understands the truth completely and refuses to be afraid of fighting for it until the very end. Months after the trial concluded, Angela continued her work much as she always had, taking on new clients who arrived at her office, carrying the same quiet fear she had seen so many times before. She rarely spoke publicly about the case once it was settled, preferring instead to let her actions continue speaking for her the way they always had throughout her career. Marcus Webb later said that meeting her had changed the way he understood his own rights, teaching him that silence was a choice rather than an obligation forced upon him by circumstance. Other residents who had once felt invisible within their own community began attending city council meetings, asking questions they would never have dared raise before, emboldened by what they had witnessed unfold in that courtroom. The department itself, under new leadership appointed in the months following the scandal, made a point of publicly acknowledging the failures that had allowed Derek Collins to operate without consequence for so many years. It was not a perfect reckoning, and Angela herself often said that real change took far longer than any single trial could deliver, but it was a beginning that the city had never managed to reach before. People who had once crossed the street rather than make eye contact with an officer began to notice small differences in how they were approached and treated during routine encounters. It would take years, she knew, for trust to rebuild itself fully, but she also knew that trust never rebuilds at all without someone willing to take the first difficult step toward it. In quiet moments, when reporters or curious neighbors asked her to summarize what the entire ordeal had taught her, Angela tended to return to the same simple idea each time. She explained that power left, unexamined, will always expand to fill whatever space silence allows it, and that the only real defense against it was the steady, unglamorous work of paying attention, asking questions, and refusing to look away when something felt wrong. It was not the kind of lesson that made headlines on its own, she admitted, but it was the kind that, applied patiently and consistently, eventually changed entire institutions from the inside out. And for everyone who had once felt powerless in that small southern city, her example remained a steady reminder that even the most confident abuse of power could be undone by someone who simply refused to stop looking for the truth.